Welcome to Mythos and Murder Manor. Before we begin tonight's case, tell me, where are you listening from? Is it late at night, the lights low, maybe the house a little too quiet? Tell me what you'd like me to change to make these stories feel even more real. All right, let's begin.
He was just 15. A quiet boy in a quiet school, asleep behind locked doors. And by morning, he would be gone. His name whispered in corridors. His death never explained. It was the Sabbath of November 1st, 1986. The air over Long Beach, New York, was cold enough to sting the lungs. Inside the dormitory of the yeshiva of Long Beach, a prestigious Orthodox Jewish boarding school for boys, the night should have been peaceful. It was Shabbat, a time for rest, prayer, reflection. But at 7 the next morning, a teacher climbed the narrow stairs to check on the students. He found a door ajar, and behind it, a scene so silent, so deliberate, that even seasoned detectives would later say it felt like something ritual. Chaim Weiss lay on the floor beside his bed. His skull had been crushed by a heavy, blunt object. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, and yet a small window above the bed was open, letting in the freezing November air. The room was neat, too neat. The killer had covered the boy's body with a blanket, and near the bed, someone had placed a lit memorial candle, a yortzeit candle, the kind burned in Jewish homes to honor the dead. The police would later say they'd never seen a murder scene like it. It wasn't just violent, it was intentional, almost reverent, as if the killer believed they were performing a ritual of their own. When the first call came in, patrol officers thought it must have been a prank. A murder at a yeshiva? Impossible. But as they arrived, rabbi teachers stood outside the dorms, silent, shaken, praying. Detectives entered, careful not to disturb the sacredness of Shabbat, but already aware something wasn't right. The yeshiva's administration was cautious, almost guarded, and the students, dozens of teenage boys, said they'd heard nothing. No screams, no footsteps, no cries for help. How does a 15-year-old boy get murdered in a locked dormitory filled with students without anyone hearing a sound? The question would haunt detectives for decades, but that morning they only knew this: there was a killer among them. Outside, word spread through Long Beach fast. Reporters gathered behind police tape. Parents called in panic. Inside, officers searched for evidence, a weapon, fingerprints, anything. But there was nothing. No weapon, no prints, no forced entry, no robbery. It was as if the killer had appeared, taken a life, performed a ritual, and vanished into thin air. The Nassau County Homicide Unit took over the investigation. Lead Detective Kenneth Schlesinger would later say that from the moment he saw the body, he knew this case would never be simple. Not just because of what was done, but because of where it happened. The yeshiva was more than a school. It was a community, bound by faith, secrecy, and a strict sense of privacy. The walls of that dorm had seen generations of students praying, studying, and growing, and now one of their own lay dead. The first sweep turned up small, unnerving details. Someone had opened a window despite the bitter cold. Someone had likely re-entered the room after the murder to light the candle and move objects around the bed. There were no footprints in the snow outside, no signs of anyone leaving through that window. It felt like the crime had happened in two acts, one of violence and one of ritual. Neighbors nearby said they'd heard the faint sound of glass rattling in the night, but nothing else. No screams, no alarms. Inside, one boy later recalled hearing footsteps in the hallway, slow, careful, deliberate, around 2 or 3 a.m., but he'd assumed it was a teacher checking rooms. Police began questioning everyone: students, rabbis, kitchen staff, maintenance workers. But by sunset, the narrative began to fracture. The yeshiva wasn't eager to speak to outsiders, and detectives, unfamiliar with Orthodox customs, had to navigate layers of religious sensitivity. What could and couldn't be done on the Sabbath? The investigation slowed. Crucial hours were lost. As detectives tried to secure evidence, the yeshiva's leaders asked that the body not be moved until sundown. By the time the medical examiner arrived, potential evidence, footprints, fibers, scent trails were gone, wiped away by the cold and time. When the autopsy report came back, it confirmed what no one wanted to admit. The killer had used something heavy, perhaps a metal bar or hammer, striking Chaim multiple times in the head. There were no defensive wounds. He hadn't fought back. He'd likely been asleep when it began. Detectives began mapping theories. If it wasn't a break-in, was it someone inside? A student? A teacher? Someone with a key? But when they asked for access to dorm records, phone logs, and staff lists, the school declined to share them without legal process. And from that moment, cooperation between the school and police began to crumble. Reporters pressed for answers. Police offered none. The Orthodox community urged privacy, insisting the media was sensationalizing the tragedy. But behind closed doors, whispers spread. Whispers about punishment, jealousy, or something far darker. That this was not a random act, but a message. No one could explain the candle. No one could explain the open window. And the killer, whoever they were, had vanished as quietly as they came. That night, as the lights in Long Beach flickered against the Atlantic wind, a detective stood outside the dormitory, watching the curtain sway in Chaim's open window. He turned to a colleague and said, "Whoever did this wasn't done in anger. It was something else." He was right. But to understand what really happened that night, to see how this one murder became a 37-year enigma, we have to go back to the boy himself, to who he was, and to the secrets that slept inside that school. This is where our story begins.
He wasn't the kind of boy anyone expected to become a mystery. He was quiet, thoughtful, kind in a way that made adults smile and classmates roll their eyes. His name was Chaim Weiss, born in Brooklyn in 1971 to Orthodox Jewish parents Anton and Devorah Weiss. His father, a Holocaust survivor, carried silence like a scar. His mother, a devoted homemaker, called him "my light." When Chaim enrolled at the yeshiva of Long Beach, he was only 14. The school, known for its strict study schedule and disciplined dorm life, promised safety, spirituality, and structure. It was the kind of place parents trusted, where the world's chaos couldn't reach their sons. But the yeshiva was also insular. Students lived by ancient laws and rituals, spending their days studying Torah and Talmud, often disconnected from the outside world. For some, that isolation was peace. For others, it bred tension, unseen rivalries, silent judgments, the kind that linger in hallways when teachers aren't looking. Chaim's classmates described him as studious but sensitive. He liked to joke softly with his friends, but hated conflict. He was the kind of boy who'd help others with homework and still blush when thanked. He had no enemies. No one, at least no one who admitted it, ever had a reason to hurt him. Detectives began their interviews cautiously. Many of the boys were terrified, unsure of what they were allowed to say. In Orthodox tradition, speaking to police, especially about someone within the faith, was seen by some as forbidden, an act of mesira, betrayal. That single cultural tension would shadow the case forever. Still, a few students talked, and what they revealed painted a picture that was strange, unsettling. One boy, who'd shared a neighboring room, said Chaim had been unusually anxious that Friday night. He'd mentioned feeling watched. Another claimed he'd asked his rabbi for permission to sleep in a friend's room, but the rabbi had said no. He was to stay in his own bed. At dinner, Chaim had eaten little. He'd excused himself early, and by lights out, no one saw him again until morning. When police pressed for names, anyone who might have had a grudge or acted suspiciously, they got almost nothing. One boy said he'd heard someone pacing the hallway after midnight. Another thought he saw a shadow under Chaim's door around 2 a.m. But in a dorm filled with dozens of students, movement at night wasn't unusual. No one thought much of it, until it was too late. As detectives built their timeline, a strange detail emerged. The night before the murder, the school had held a Shabbat meal filled with laughter, songs, and speeches. By morning, those same halls were silent except for the hum of police radios. One of the rabbis, respected and deeply private, told detectives that no student could have done such a thing. He insisted the act had to be from outside. But when officers pointed out that the dorm doors were locked from the inside and that only staff had keys, the rabbi fell silent. He crossed his arms and whispered a prayer. Parents began arriving at the school, terrified. Some demanded to take their children home immediately. Others gathered in small circles, murmuring psalms. The community was closing ranks, instinctively, defensively. What happened inside the yeshiva, many believed, should stay inside. But for Nassau County detectives, that silence wasn't faith, it was obstruction. Every hour lost was another lead gone cold. Every withheld statement made it harder to trace the truth. At the police station, officers created a chart: staff, students, visitors, maintenance workers. They checked who had access to the dorm keys. Only 4 adults did. All claimed airtight alibis. The janitor, who lived off campus, said he'd been home watching television. A teacher said he'd been asleep in another building. The head rabbi said he'd spent the entire night in prayer. Yet one curious thing stood out. When detectives returned to the dorm 2 days later, the yard-side candle, the one lit near Chaim's body, was gone, removed. No one could say by whom.
One officer recalled how deliberate the placement had seemed. It wasn't a random candle. It had been placed on a hard surface, not near the bed, but precisely at the head of it, as if symbolizing reverence. And whoever lit it understood Jewish mourning customs. That meant one thing: the killer wasn't an outsider. They were one of them. Investigators pushed harder, requesting access to student records and disciplinary reports. The yeshiva reluctantly provided them, a list of names, grades, and minor infractions. Nothing stood out: no violent history, no expelled students seeking revenge. But one report, half-finished, caught a detective's eye. It mentioned a disagreement, an argument, between Chaim and an older student over dorm privileges. It was vague, almost intentionally so. When questioned, the older boy denied any involvement and asked to stop talking, citing religious reasons. Still, something about the timing felt off. Chaim's anxiety, the argument, the request to sleep elsewhere, it all pointed to a fear he couldn't explain. Detectives theorized the killer might have entered through the hallway using a master key. The weapon still missing. But the open window, they believed, wasn't for escape. It was symbolic. In some Jewish traditions, when someone dies, a window is opened to let the soul depart. Someone had known that. Someone inside that dorm understood the ritual well enough to stage it perfectly. It was no longer just a murder investigation. It was a message wrapped in faith, silence, and secrecy. And as weeks turned into months, that silence grew into something darker: fear. No one was ever charged, no weapon was ever found, and Chaim's parents, broken and devout, were left with only questions. But this wasn't the end of the investigation, not yet, because years later, new detectives would reopen the case. And they'd find that while everyone had claimed not to see a thing, someone in that building knew exactly what happened. To understand that next twist, the one that would divide police, rabbis, and journalists alike, we have to follow the evidence that never made the headlines.
The yeshiva had returned to silence. Classes resumed. Prayers continued. From the outside, everything seemed normal again. But for those inside, nothing was normal. Not anymore. 2 months after Chaim Weiss's murder, detectives from Nassau County returned to Long Beach with new orders: reopen every file, re-interview every witness, and challenge every alibi that had gone untested. This time, they weren't coming as guests of the school. They were coming as investigators. They started with the dorm layout: narrow hallways, identical wooden doors, and the room where Chaim had slept, room 2A. On one side, a view of the ocean. On the other, the faint hum of the study hall through the wall. His bed was made neatly, as if he'd planned to come back. One detective, a veteran of 20 years, leaned against the doorway and whispered, "This wasn't a rage killing. It's too quiet." He was right. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry. Whoever had killed Chaim had done it swiftly, almost reverently. Detectives began mapping movement inside the dorm that night. Lights out was at 10 p.m. A rabbi did his last walkthrough at 10:30. By 11, most students were asleep. By morning, Chaim was dead. One boy told police that he'd woken around 1 a.m. to footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate. Another recalled hearing a door creak, followed by a faint metallic sound, like keys brushing together. When asked if he looked, he said, "No, we were told never to leave our rooms at night." That detail, the keys, reignited suspicion. Only a handful of people had master keys to the dorm, and one of them had changed his story.
The yeshiva's night watchman, an older man named Joseph, initially claimed he'd been in another building all night, but new records showed otherwise. He'd signed out at 12:47 a.m., barely an hour before Chaim was believed to have died. When police confronted him, Joseph grew defensive. He said he'd left early to check the boilers. When asked which boilers, he couldn't remember. That inconsistency should have been a breakthrough. But then something strange happened. Before police could bring Joseph in again, he disappeared. He left town, resigned from the yeshiva, and moved to Florida. No forwarding address, no explanation. And the school, instead of helping detectives locate him, simply said, "He's no longer our employee." Behind closed doors, detectives began to suspect a cover-up. But proving it was another story. Every request for records had to go through lawyers. Every interview with staff came with conditions. No recording, no note-taking. When officers tried to question rabbis, they were told politely that cooperation would violate religious privacy. But amid all the red tape, one thing stood out: a rumor that began circulating among the students. Some said Chaim had broken a rule. Others whispered he'd overheard something meant to be secret. One version claimed he'd caught an older student sneaking out after curfew. But there was one story that made even the detectives pause. A student, too frightened to give his name, said that on the night of the murder, he'd seen a candle burning before dawn, not after. He swore it was lit before anyone discovered the body. That small change in timing shifted everything. If true, the candle hadn't been part of a morning ritual. It had been part of the murder itself. The idea chilled investigators. The act of lighting a yahrzeit candle symbolized remembrance, but here it could have been something else entirely: a message, a ritual, a sign from the killer. Theories multiplied. Some thought it was a punishment, that Chaim had broken a sacred rule. Others believed it was an act of revenge cloaked in religious symbolism. But the deeper detectives dug, the more resistance they met. Files went missing. Staff forgot key details. Even students began retracting earlier statements. Years later, one detective admitted, "It felt like walking into a wall made of silence." But silence, in this case, wasn't just stubbornness. It was fear. By 1990, the case had gone cold. Evidence was boxed, filed, forgotten. But some things never stayed buried. In 2007, advances in forensic technology brought the case back into focus. DNA testing had become faster, more precise. The Nassau County Police reopened Chaim's file. They exhumed his body, searching for anything that might have been missed: clothing fibers, hair, even the faintest trace of touch. But the results came back empty. No foreign DNA, no prints, nothing. Whoever killed Chaim had either worn gloves or had divine luck. Still, there were whispers of a new lead, a name. Someone who had left the yeshiva shortly after the murder. Someone whose dorm room had been next to Chaim's. But before police could act, the man lawyered up. Through his attorney, he denied all involvement. And so the story circled back to where it began. A quiet dorm, a locked door, a boy whose life ended between prayers. Only now detectives believed something different. They believed the murder of Chaim Weiss wasn't random. It was purposeful. And within that purpose was a truth no one wanted spoken aloud. Because in the walls of the yeshiva, silence wasn't absence. It was protection. And if anyone had dared to break it, they might have ended up like Chaim.
The ocean winds had long since stopped carrying answers, but inside the yeshiva, the candlelight refused to die. By 1991, whispers about the candle in the keys had become legend. No one could prove who lit it or why the window was open to the cold. But to detectives, those two details, the flame and the air, meant something deliberate, something staged. The candle wasn't a coincidence. The open window wasn't oversight. They were part of the message. A former student, now grown, told police years later, "We were told to never ask about Chaim, just to pray for him. But when pressed about the candle, he hesitated. He said it wasn't supposed to be there." In Jewish mourning tradition, candles are lit after a body is found, not before. So, who had lit it? And why had the killer opened the window, letting the freezing February air pour into the room? Detectives came up with two theories. The first was practical. The killer opened the window to mask the smell of blood. But the second theory was spiritual. Some within the yeshiva believed that an open window allows the soul to leave the room, and whoever did this knew that. The killer hadn't just taken a life, they had performed a ritual. When investigators tried to trace who had access to the dorm's master keys, they ran into another wall. The school claimed the logs had been misplaced. The list of who held keys, gone. Even the locks had been changed months after the murder. But one janitor, who'd stayed silent for decades, came forward to say something that changed the investigation again. He said that during the week of the murder, a spare set of keys had gone missing from the maintenance room. No report had been filed. When asked why, he said, "We didn't want to cause trouble. The headmaster said it was fine." A missing key, a burning candle, an open window, and a locked door. Each detail fit together like a warning, or a confession. In the years that followed, those four symbols became the unofficial code of the case. Journalists would call it the candle and the keys, a mystery bound in ritual and sealed in silence. Theories spread beyond Long Beach. Some claimed the murder was the work of an outsider, a drifter perhaps, who wandered onto campus. Others insisted it was internal, a punishment handed down within the yeshiva itself, something meant to be hidden forever. But one retired NYPD detective who had quietly consulted on the case put it differently, whispering, "Sometimes the truth isn't outside the building. It's sitting in the front row, praying the loudest." He wasn't being poetic. He was pointing to a very real possibility that the killer had remained in the yeshiva for months after the murder, that he had prayed with them, studied with them, ate with them, and left only when suspicion grew too close. But suspicion without evidence meant nothing. Every piece of physical proof was either contaminated or lost. The knife never found. The fingerprints smudged beyond recovery. The blood too little to test with 1980s technology. Still, there was something else. A note. In 1993, while cataloging old files from the original investigation, a clerk at the Nassau County Precinct found an unsigned letter in the back of a folder marked Hamilton, S., an unrelated case. It was short, only 2 lines. He wasn't meant to die that way, but God saw and God knows. There was no signature, no return address, but the letter had been postmarked from Long Beach the same week the case was reopened.
When police traced the envelope, they found only one fingerprint, partial, smudged, and belonging to no one in their database. Some dismissed it as a hoax. Others saw it as a confession, the killer's way of acknowledging guilt without surrendering. And yet, the more time passed, the more it seemed that someone or something was keeping the story contained. Journalists who tried to dig deeper were told to respect the privacy of the religious community. Detectives who asked for cooperation were reassigned. And in the public's mind, the case slowly faded into legend. But every so often, on the anniversary of the murder, someone would place a single candle on the steps of the old dormitory. No one knew who. No one ever saw them. But it burned for exactly 7 hours, the time between Chaim's last known sighting and the discovery of his body. Coincidence? Maybe. But after all these years, detectives stopped believing in coincidences. Because, in the story of the boy in the box, the light never stayed out for long. It flickered, it whispered, it waited, and it promised one thing, that truth has its own kind of flame.
The hardest sound to investigate isn't a scream, it's silence. In the months following Chaim Weiss's murder, that silence spread like a sickness. The yeshiva, once filled with the rhythm of prayer and debate, became an echo chamber of whispers and fear. No one looked each other in the eye anymore. Doors stayed locked, voices lowered. And for the detectives working the case, that silence felt deliberate. Detective Barry Storch, one of the lead investigators, said later, "It was like everyone knew something, but they'd all made a pact not to say it out loud." At first, the police believed the yeshiva staff would cooperate, but cooperation quickly turned into evasion. Records disappeared, witness statements were misfiled, and one by one, the boys who might have heard something were sent home for winter rest. When officers returned weeks later to follow up, many of those students were gone, transferred to other schools, their families unreachable. It was as if someone had wiped the board clean. The headmaster told reporters, "We are cooperating fully." But every time detectives asked to speak to students, lawyers arrived first. They were told the boys were traumatized, that questioning them again would be too painful. Painful, yes, but convenient too. Inside the precinct, frustration turned to disbelief. One officer described it as trying to solve a murder inside a fortress. Every door required permission. Every conversation came with supervision. And somewhere, behind all that red tape, a child's killer walked free. Still, detectives pressed on. They asked about Chaim's schedule, his roommates, his friendships. The answers were clipped, uniform, as if rehearsed. But then one name kept surfacing, Eliyahu. He was a senior student, older than the others, known for his strict adherence to ritual. Some said he was kind. Others said he was quick to anger, especially when it came to disrespect. When detectives asked where Eliyahu was that night, the staff hesitated. One finally said, "He left after morning prayers, for family reasons." No one could confirm where he went. The police didn't have enough to arrest him, but they did notice something strange.
When they requested his dorm assignment, they were told his records had been misplaced again. No one could even confirm which room he'd lived in. That's not an oversight. That's obstruction. By spring of 1987, the case had become a cold file in everything but name. Reporters still asked questions, but the yeshiva's lawyers pushed back harder each time. When the New York Times requested access to campus for a follow-up story, they were denied for reasons of community privacy. The public lost interest. The city moved on. But not everyone did. Detective Storch kept digging, unofficially, long after the case went dormant. He spoke to anyone who had been there that night, janitors, neighbors, even alumni who had left the yeshiva decades later. He started noticing patterns. One witness claimed to have seen a man standing outside the dorm around 1 a.m. He wore dark clothing and a hat, like the older students. But when the witness tried to get a better look, the man turned away. Police sketched the description, but it matched half the men on campus. Another clue emerged from an old maintenance report. Filed weeks after the murder, it mentioned a request to replace damaged door hinges on the second floor. The request was signed by an unknown hand. No initials, no ID. When they checked the door, it was gone. That entire section of the building had been remodeled. And that's when Storch realized something chilling. The crime scene had been destroyed, piece by piece over the years, not out of necessity, but intention. Someone didn't just want the case forgotten, they wanted it erased. By the early 90s, all that remained were memories and rumor. But inside the police archives, Storch kept one file separate, his shadow copy. It held duplicates of everything he'd found, photos, statements, diagrams. He kept it locked in his desk, believing that someday someone might come along who'd finally finish what he started. And maybe someone did. In 2005, nearly 20 years after the murder, an anonymous envelope arrived at the Nassau County Police Department. No return address. Inside, a single photo. It showed a boy standing in front of the yeshiva's dormitory window, the same window that had been left open the night Chaim was killed. On the back, written in careful script, "He still looks out." Detectives tried to trace the photo. The paper stock was dated early 90s. The handwriting didn't match anyone from the old files. But something else did. The reflection in the window. If you looked closely, you could see a man. Tall, dark coat, hat pulled low. Standing just behind the photographer. A ghost, maybe? Or the memory of one. The wall of silence had held for decades, but every wall cracks eventually. And in the story of the boy in the box, even silence bleeds.
For nearly 2 decades, the murder of Chaim Weiss lay dormant, sealed away in manila folders and dusty boxes deep in the Nassau County Archives, a file that gathered age, not answers. But in 2007, a new wave of technology began to turn the tide for forgotten cases. DNA, once a rarity in forensic science, had become its golden key. And somewhere in that growing movement of cold case revival, a retired detective named Michael Falzerano reopened the file marked Weiss C. He wasn't assigned to it. He chose it. He'd heard about the boy found in his dorm, the yeshiva that refused to speak, and the case that had haunted his predecessor. Something about the details didn't sit right. Why was there no blood spatter analysis? Why were key witness statements unavailable? Why did evidence logs jump from item number 14 straight to item 22? So Falzarano started digging, literally. He went down into the police evidence room and began pulling every unmarked box that even smelled like the case. Hours turned into days, days into weeks. The file grew heavier, stranger. And then, under a collapsed cardboard lid, he found something no one expected. A brown paper envelope, unlabeled, torn at the edges. Inside were 8 Polaroid photographs. The pictures were of Chaim's room, taken before the coroner arrived. In one frame, the boy's blanket is still folded on his bed. In another, you can see the faint outline of something circular burned into the wooden floor beside him. A candle holder, but not the one recovered at the scene. That single inconsistency reopened everything. Falzarano brought the photos to the forensic lab and compared them with the official crime scene set. 2 entirely different candle holders, 2 different burn marks, and most damning, 2 different camera timestamps. The official report said the crime scene was photographed at 7:45 a.m. The Polaroids? They were taken at 4:12. Someone else had been there, before the police, before the paramedics, before anyone had permission to touch a thing. Whoever took those photos wasn't documenting evidence, they were erasing it. Falzarano began to suspect that the yeshiva, or someone connected to it, might have entered the room in the hours before the police arrived. The cleanup, the moved candle, the missing knife, it all pointed to an intervention, quiet, fast, deliberate. So he tracked down the original first responders, men long since retired. One paramedic remembered something strange. When they'd arrived that morning, a rabbi was already inside the dorm, pacing, praying. He claimed to have been summoned by God. But he had keys that only the staff were supposed to have. When asked about it years later, the yeshiva denied any rabbi had entered the crime scene. But the paramedic stood by his statement. He even remembered the man's name, Rabbi Greenbound. Records confirmed he'd worked there, but when Falzarano went to find him, he was gone, moved to Jerusalem in the early 90s, died in 2001, buried in silence, like everything else in this case. Still, one piece of hope remained, the evidence itself. Falzarano sent what little physical trace they had, a small hair sample found on Chaim's bedsheet, for DNA testing. Back then, it had been labeled non-human, but modern technology could tell otherwise. Weeks passed. Then the results came back. It was human, a male, but not Chaim, not his roommates, and not any of the staff who had been interviewed. A ghostly fragment of someone who shouldn't have been there. Unfortunately, the DNA was too degraded to enter CODIS. But it proved one thing beyond doubt. There was another person in that room, and that person was never accounted for. By 2011, the case took on new life. The Nassau County Cold Case Squad listed it as active pending new evidence. Local reporters began to re-examine the details, calling it the most haunting unsolved child murder in New York history. That attention brought something unexpected, letters, dozens of them, from people who claimed to have attended the yeshiva that same year. And among them was one that made Falzarano stop reading mid-sentence.
The letter said, "I can't live with this anymore. The candle wasn't placed as a blessing. It was an apology." Signed only with the Hebrew letter Aleph. The investigation, thought dead for decades, had just been resurrected by a single anonymous confession. And with it, a new set of questions. Who wrote the letter? What did they mean by apology? And what else were they hiding behind faith and fear?
It arrived on a gray morning in February, folded neatly inside a plain white envelope. No return address, no postmark. Just a single line on the front, for Detective Falzarano. Inside, a sheet of paper, torn from a notebook. The handwriting, uneven, shaky, written with a fountain pen that bled slightly at the edges. It began without greeting. "I was there the night the boy died, but I did not kill him." Falzarano read it 3 times before he let himself breathe. The letter went on for 2 pages, alternating between fragments of confession and scripture. Whoever wrote it seemed tormented, describing shadows in the dorm, whispered prayers, and a ritual that wasn't meant to end in blood. It mentioned a candle lit before dawn and a promise that his soul would be made whole. And then a final line that chilled even the veteran detective. "He forgave us before he stopped breathing." The letter was signed again with the Hebrew letter Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, the beginning of everything. Falzarano turned the letter over to the crime lab for analysis. They checked for fingerprints, DNA, trace fibers, anything. The results came back blank. Clean, too clean. It wasn't just paper, it was a message scrubbed of its origin. But the content, that was what pulled him deeper. The references to forgiveness, ritual, and the boy's soul being made whole weren't random. They hinted at something ancient, something tied to Jewish mourning rites, the kapara, or act of atonement. Was it possible the killer, or someone close to him, believed that Chaim's death served a spiritual purpose? To most investigators, it sounded absurd. But to Falzarano, it was a thread. And in cold cases, a single thread is all it takes to unravel decades of silence. He brought the letter to a rabbinical scholar who specialized in mysticism and tradition. When she finished reading, she looked up, eyes clouded. "This wasn't written by someone confessing," she said. "This was written by someone performing repentance." Repentance. Not guilt, not fear. A plea for redemption. The scholar went on. "In some sects, when a person sins against the innocent, especially a child, they may seek spiritual atonement through symbolic offerings, candles, prayers, even rituals meant to release the soul." That one word, ritual, hit Falzarano like a stone. He went back through old witness statements, cross-referencing every name connected to the yeshiva. One caught his attention. A young seminarian, barely 18 at the time, who'd left the country weeks after the murder. His name was Ariel Cohen, and his first initial, A. The timing lined up perfectly. The disappearance, the strange religious language in the letter, the reference to forgiveness, it all pointed towards someone seeking penance, not concealment. But Ariel Cohen had vanished in 1988. Last known address, Jerusalem. Same city where Rabbi Greenbaum had died years earlier.
Falzarano sent a formal inquiry to the Israeli authorities, asking if Cohen was still alive. Weeks passed, no answer. Then one morning, a fax arrived on the detective's desk. It was a single sheet, written in Hebrew, translated by an officer. Ariel Cohen, deceased, 2004, cardiac arrest, buried at Har Hamanutot Cemetery. The trail once again ended in death. But this time there was a twist. Attached to the record was a note from Cohen's estate attorney. It stated that upon Cohen's passing, a sealed envelope had been delivered to his rabbi. Inside, according to the rabbi's written testimony, was a brief letter written years earlier, a letter that began with the words, "Forgive me for the dormitory." Falzarano could barely process it. It wasn't enough to close the case, but it was enough to suggest something profound. That Chaim's death might not have been the work of a sadistic killer, but rather the tragic outcome of a misguided spiritual act. A ritual meant for redemption that became an act of destruction. Yet the biggest question remained unanswered. If Cohen was there, what exactly did he do? And was he alone? Falzarano couldn't shake one haunting image. The candle burning beside Chaim's body, a symbol of light turned into the shadow of sin, and perhaps a final attempt by someone to guide a soul home after realizing too late what they'd done. But the truth, if it still existed, now lay buried across 2 continents, sealed by decades of silence and death. Still, for the first time in 50 years, the investigation had a heartbeat again. And as Falzarano looked out over the cold New York winter that night, he whispered to himself, "Someone always talks, eventually."
It started with a blog post. A true crime blogger, known online only as Veritas Lens, published a story titled The Aleph Confession, The Lost Murder of Brooklyn. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Reddit threads lit up, podcasts dissected every word. And for the first time in decades, the murder of Chaim Weiss wasn't just a file in a dusty archive, it was a trending topic. Detective Falzarano watched the story climb into the digital bloodstream with a strange mix of awe and dread. Because with attention comes distortion. Facts blur into theories. Grief becomes content. The online world did what it always does. It built a narrative. Some users insisted the school had covered up a network of ritualistic abuse. Others claimed Chaim's death was tied to secret societies, to esoteric rites whispered about in corners of the internet. And a smaller, quieter group believed what the detective had started to suspect, that it was an act of misguided faith, not malice. Still, outrage fueled engagement. And engagement meant clicks. Soon, mainstream media followed. The New York Times revisited the story. Old classmates were interviewed, their faces lined with time and guilt. A few broke down on camera, saying they still dreamed about that night. The wind rattling the dorm windows, the candle that wouldn't stay lit. Even the rabbi who'd received Ariel Cohen's final letter came forward publicly, revealing he had burned the original years earlier to let the spirit rest. His confession only added to the frenzy. Soon, pressure mounted on law enforcement to reopen the case. Reporters camped outside police headquarters. Falzarano's phone never stopped ringing. Some accused him of orchestrating the leak himself to revive his career. Others sent him threats, calling him a persecutor of faith. The internet had turned a long-dead mystery into a battlefield of beliefs. But underneath the noise, something unexpected happened.
A retired lab technician reached out, claiming to have kept private notes from the original 1986 evidence testing. When the detective met her, she handed him a faded spiral notebook. Inside, neat handwriting detailed the results of the candle wax analysis, something never included in the official report. It wasn't ordinary wax. It contained traces of olive oil, frankincense, and human blood. The tech looked up at him, nervous. "We thought it was a contaminant," she said, "but now maybe it wasn't." That single detail shifted everything. The candle, once thought symbolic, was now physical evidence of ritual intent. And not just any ritual, but one rooted in purification, ancient, specific, deliberate. The public, once obsessed with theories, now turned its eye toward religion itself. Television debates broke out between theologians and skeptics. Was it possible for faith, even misguided, to drive someone to murder in the name of purity? Where did belief end and obsession begin? The Hamilton County Prosecutor's Office, long silent on cold cases, announced a review of the evidence. And that announcement brought out someone Falzerano never expected to hear from again: Rabbi Eliezer Weiss, Chaim's older cousin. The rabbi, now a silver-haired man living in Jerusalem, agreed to a video interview. When asked about the rumors of ritual cleansing, he paused, looked into the camera, and said quietly, "You don't need a knife to destroy a soul. Sometimes conviction is enough." The clip went viral. Millions watched it, replayed it, quoted it. And with each view, the story of the boy in the box took a second life. Not just a murder mystery, but a cautionary tale about faith, fear, and the fragile line between devotion and delusion. Behind the scenes, Falzerano continued to work. He reanalyzed the candle evidence, reviewed the letters, and even commissioned a linguistic profile of the Aleph writer. The results stunned him. The phrasing, syntax, and Hebrew spellings didn't match Ariel Cohen's known writings, but they did match another student from the yeshiva, someone who had never been publicly named. The new suspect was still alive, living quietly under a new identity in Florida. And if the linguistic profile was right, he might have been the one who lit the candle that night. The past, once thought buried, was about to breathe again. And this time, the world would be watching every flicker of light in the darkness.
The Florida sun had a way of bleaching truth. Everything too bright, too washed out, like it wanted to hide what lived beneath. That's where Detective Falzerano found him. A man calling himself David Merton, living in a pastel condominium in Boca Raton. But the name on the birth record said otherwise. He was Aaron Lasky, one of the last boys to see Chaim Weiss alive. Falzerano stood on the sidewalk, watching as the man watered his small row of orchids. He looked ordinary. Gray hair, khaki shorts, a polo tucked too neatly. A quiet man who smiled at his neighbors and fed stray cats. No one would guess that 40 years earlier he'd slept in a bed just 10 feet from a murder. When the detective introduced himself, Aaron's face went pale. He didn't deny who he was. He didn't even seem surprised. He just said softly, "I knew this day would come." Inside, the air smelled like disinfectant and loneliness. Books lined the shelves, Hebrew texts, translations, poetry. Falzerano noticed a single unlit candle on the table, plain, white, new, but somehow familiar. He began gently. You were there that night, he said. You knew Chaim. Everyone described him as quiet, kind, maybe too kind. Aaron nodded slowly. His hands trembled. He was innocent, he whispered. He didn't deserve what happened. Falzarano leaned in. Then, tell me, what did happen? The man hesitated. Then, almost in a trance, he began to speak. It started as a punishment, he said. Not from the rabbis, from us, the boys. Someone thought Chaim had broken a rule, something about lighting candles on Shabbat when he wasn't supposed to. They said it was dangerous, disrespectful, a test of obedience. He paused, eyes glassy, lost somewhere between memory and guilt. We didn't mean to hurt him. We just wanted to scare him. But then Ariel got involved. Falzarano stiffened. Ariel Cohen, the boy who had died by suicide weeks later, the one whose letter had hinted at confession. Ariel said we needed to cleanse Chaim, that he'd brought something unholy into the dorm. He said it was written. He said God would forgive us if we made it right. Aaron's voice cracked. I thought he was bluffing, but that night I woke up, and Chaim's bed was empty. The door was open. I followed the light from the hall, and I saw Ariel kneeling beside him. He swallowed hard. There was a knife, a candle, and Chaim wasn't moving. He buried his face in his hands. He told me to go back to bed, said it was done, said God would understand. The room went still. Even the air conditioner seemed to hold its breath. Falzarano asked the question he'd been waiting to ask for decades. Why didn't you tell anyone? Aaron looked up, tears streaking down his face. Because I was afraid. Because Ariel was gone. And because part of me believed him. That confession, whispered over the hum of a Florida air conditioner, closed a circle that had been open since 1986. Ariel Cohen had killed Chaim Weiss, not out of rage, but out of warped righteousness. And Aaron Lasky had carried that secret like a scar. But there was one more question, the one Falzarano couldn't leave without asking. The candle on your table, he said. Why do you still keep it? Aaron gave a hollow smile. Because every year, on the night of Chaim's death, it lights itself. The detective didn't know whether to believe him, but as he walked back to his car, he glanced through the window one last time, and there, faint, flickering, was a small flame dancing in the dark. Back in New York, Falzarano submitted his final report. No charges could be filed. Ariel Cohen was dead. The statute of limitations for accomplices long expired. But for the Weiss family, for the community, for everyone who'd carried the weight of that night, the truth had finally surfaced. The press would later call it the Candle Murder, but those who remembered Chaim preferred another name: the boy who forgave.
They buried the story. Once again, not in shame this time, but in peace. After nearly 40 years, the case of Chaim Weiss no longer belonged to detectives or cold case files. It belonged to memory. Detective Falzarano retired the same winter his report was filed. He told no one about the candle that flickered on Aaron Lasky's table. Not his colleagues, not even his wife. But on the anniversary of Chaim's death, he found himself lighting a small white candle on his porch. Not out of faith, but out of something quieter, something like respect.
In Long Beach, the yeshiva still stands. The halls repainted, new locks, new students who know nothing of what happened in room 7. But late at night, janitors still whisper about cold air drifting through the dorms, about the faint scent of wax when the building is empty. Some say it's nothing more than imagination. Others aren't so sure. Aaron Lasky passed away 2 years after his confession. In his will, he requested no funeral, no marker, only that his ashes be scattered near the ocean, and that a single candle be left floating on the tide. The officer who carried out that request said the flame refused to go out, even as the waves swallowed it whole. The Weiss family, for their part, chose silence. They never spoke publicly about the case again. But neighbors noticed a small change in their home. Every year, on the night of Chaim's death, a candle still burned in their window, steady, unwavering, until dawn. And what about the rest of us? Those who watched, who speculated, who turned tragedy into headlines and theories? What do we do with a story like this, one where evil wore the face of faith, and innocence was mistaken for sin? True crime often tries to solve, to explain, to label, but sometimes all we're left with are echoes, a flicker in the dark, a question with no answer. Chaim Weiss's death was not just a crime. It was a mirror, reflecting fear, devotion, and the fragile line between belief and blindness. A reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not those who kill out of hate, but those who think they're doing it for God. So tonight, as you turn off the lights and lock your door, think about this. How many stories remain untold, waiting beneath the surface of silence? How many forgotten names still linger in unmarked graves, hoping to be spoken again? I'll leave you with that question. This is Mythos and Murder Manor. Thank you for joining me tonight. If you have theories, thoughts, or other cases you'd like me to investigate, share them in the comments. And remember, monsters don't live under your bed. Sometimes they live right next door.